Welcome to lesson number 5 in our series that I'm titling The Final Day. It's loosely based on the book and study series by Adam Hamilton called 24 Hours That Changed the World. I use the same basic format, lesson and scripture format that he uses, and I use use him as some of my source material, but by no means all of my material, and I draw from many other resources, including my own research over the years. Today, in this 5th lesson, we move from the trial to the time of crucifixion. But really, before that, we'll look at the full crucifixion of Christ next week. But we kind of move that direction as Pilate hands Jesus over to the soldiers to be crucified. He has him flogged. And then in Mark 15, following verse 15b and following, we read this, and we'll read through verse 23. Then the soldiers led him into the courtyard of the palace, that is, the governor's headquarters, and they called together the whole cohort. And they clothed him in a purple cloak, and after twisting some thorns into a crown, they put it on him. And they began saluting him, "Hail, King of the Jews!" Then they struck his head with a reed, spat upon him, and knelt down in homage to him. After mocking him, they stripped him of the purple cloak and put his own clothes on him. Then they led him out to crucify him. They compelled a passerby who was coming in from the country to carry his cross. It was Simon of Cyrene, the father of Alexander and Rufus. Then they brought Jesus to the place called Golgotha, which means place of a skull. And they offered him wine mixed with myrrh, but he did not take it. Now, Mark doesn't give us a lot of detail here about what has happened. And if you're thinking, boy, I remember there being a lot more that takes place in this time, you're remembering other gospel accounts. And so before I get into the meat of the scripture, I want to, and without going too far into what can be an endless rabbit warren of biblical authorship and when books were written and audiences and all those things, I do want to say a brief word about Mark's lack of detail, most of the time at least, because there are occasions where Mark tells us something that the others don't. But his lack of detail in comparison with the other Gospels, which if you've read the other Gospels, you can't help but notice, and especially those of Matthew and Luke, which are the other two Gospels that we call synoptic Gospels for synopsis. They tell a story kind of in a linear fashion, whereas the Gospel of John bounces around back and forth. He might tell an event that happens right before Jesus goes to Jerusalem, and then he might pop back to something early in his ministry. Matthew, Mark, and Luke do more of a linear fashion. Well, it's believed, and I trust the biblical scholarship on this, that Matthew had access to Mark's gospel when he was writing his own gospel, which means, of course, that Mark would be the first gospel written. Matthew includes a lot of details that Mark does not. Mark's gospel is 16 chapters, Matthew's is 28. And a general rule of thumb in trying to date ancient text and figure out which came first is that the shortest text is usually the oldest text. And it makes sense if you think about it, because while they were all eventually circulated in the church, they did have different audiences initially, or focuses on their audiences initially. And it makes sense then that Matthew might have included some details that Mark did not, maybe to help explain or further demonstrate who Jesus was. And the way I like to think about it is that if you're telling a story to someone who knows you, maybe they know your family, they know your history, there might be certain details that you leave out, or you might just casually reference. That was Bill's cousin, and that's about all you say. Because those details are known, the character of the people in the story is also known. But if you're talking to somebody who may not have that same knowledge base, and this happens to me when I move to a new place, and I'm trying to talk about members of my family, then you add details for clarification and maybe add other examples or tell other stories in order to reinforce your point. And so you have to take a little bit longer to explain things to people who may not be as familiar as others. So one of the things I'm not going to do in this lesson is give an in-depth analysis of all the different details included in each of the Gospels and do a comparison of similarities and differences in the different Gospel accounts. Although occasionally I might reference one of those. And I would encourage you to go and read the different Gospel accounts. They each offer valuable detail and insight, and those details are there for a reason, at least for the reason of that particular gospel writer. So I encourage you to do that, and there's some good resources out there where you can pull up pages that have the gospels side by side in what's called a parallel format. I would encourage you to do that. We're not going to do that today, though. So let's get back to the actual text of the Gospel of Mark. Pilate hands Jesus over to be crucified, and he has him flogged. And I didn't go into detail in the last lesson of what flogging was, because flogging was more than just him being beaten. He's beaten earlier, and now Pilate or the soldiers flog him. Pilate hands him over to the soldiers, and now what happens in the crucifixion and all those details and everything that happened, Pilate, remember, has washed his hands of it. He's done with it. And the soldiers are in charge now. So they take him into the governor's headquarters, and it says along with the whole cohort. Now Adam Hamilton tells us that the cohort is between 200 and 300 soldiers. And I don't know about you, but when I think about this, picture it in my mind, or maybe have seen it in movies or other depictions, there's a smaller number of people. But think about what it would have been like if Jesus is there in front of 200 or 300 different soldiers. They are definitely maintaining control in the midst of that. And then they are there as Jesus is flogged. Flogging involved a person being tied to a post, his hands over the post like that, and he's tied where he cannot move, his back exposed. They used a whip, and the whip would have been embedded with fish hooks and metal and glass and some combination of that in order to literally strip the flesh from a person. It's possible that this flogging, and often this flogging, though not always, was done on the front as well as the back. And it was designed, as ancient historians said, to expose the veins and to tear the muscles and the tendons. It was extremely brutal. And flogging was designed to severely weaken the body and take the body up to the brink of death without actually killing the person. So by the time of the crucifixion, as painful as all of that was, the body was already, the nerve endings, everything was already at its height of sensitivity and pain. The body was already severely bloodied and severely weakened. So it was not only the crucifixion that was so painful and humiliating, it was everything that led up to it. They put a cloak around his shoulders, a purple cloak, and that's important because purple was the color of royalty. And it's part of the mocking that he endured as they salute him, as they mock him, as they put a crown of thorns and they put it down on his head, as they hit him with a reed to kind of mimic like a staff or a scepter is what that would have done. You see, it wasn't enough to arrest him and imprison him and beat him and to flog him. Now they were making a point for all to see about this is what happens when you try to rise up against the Roman Empire. This is what happens when you claim to be a king. And remember, all the soldiers would have really known is that that there was this claim, King of the Jews. Remember, it's put on the inscription. We'll talk more about that in the next lesson. Well, being a king was treasonous, and the message was clear. Those who claim to have authority that's equal to or opposed to or greater than the emperor will be treated in the harshest fashion. They then take him to the place called Golgotha, which means the place of a skull. It was about a third of a mile from the headquarters to this place, and Jesus had to carry the cross. Now, a lot of the depictions have Jesus carrying the entire cross. But in actuality, he would have only carried the horizontal beam. The vertical beam would have already been in place. But that doesn't mean that it wasn't heavy. The cross beam alone, which he would have either carried like this or carried like this, the cross beam alone weighed between 75 and 100 pounds. So it was still very heavy to carry for any distance. And a third of a mile really isn't that far, but at least for Cleveland people, a third of a mile, it is a third of a mile from the parsonage to the edge of Delta State's campus. And while that's not a long distance, I can tell you that at least in the summertime when I do that, by the time I get there, I'm already kind of sweating. And you think about somebody carrying a beam that heavy, that's a pretty good distance even if you were healthy. And then we think about the fact that Jesus had now been awake for all of these hours. He had slept on the Wednesday night before, but gotten up early that morning. And so he had been up all day Thursday, and this was now Friday morning. And so he had been beaten, he had been shackled, he had been flogged, he had had to walk down from the Garden of Gethsemane over into this area, walk back and forth, and all that they did. And remember, the flogging was designed to take the body to the brink, such a weakened state that was the brink of death. Now, John states in his gospel that Jesus carried his cross. But, of course, it's quite possible that what happened was that Jesus tried, or they make him try. He cannot carry the cross anymore. And so Simon of Cyrene is compelled to take the cross. Now, I'm going to go back at the end of this lesson and kind of give an encapsulation. But I do want to spend a little bit of time on Simon of Cyrene because in the midst of all these horrendous things, you have this bit of redemption and this bit of hope and this bit of transformation that we see with Simon of Cyrene. Simon of Cyrene is described as a passerby, which means that originally, it's Mark's way of saying he was not there originally to see Jesus. He was not part of the crowd calling for crucifixion. And it's in all likelihood he had been walking there in Jerusalem during the season of Passover, going from one place to the other, and he's just walking. He gets interrupted and stopped by this procession that of soldiers and people that are taking Jesus, walking that distance to the time from the headquarters to Golgotha. In all likelihood, he was there in town for the Passover. Jews tried to make it to the Passover as often as they could, at least once in their lifetime, because this was the holiest time of the year. Cyrene, which it makes mention he is from, was located in North Africa, where Libya is today. By land, it was a 900-mile trek from Cyrene to Jerusalem. There had been a Jewish presence for a few centuries, going back to when Cyrene had been a Greek city, but there had been some Jews that had settled there. If Simon of Cyrene had come from Cyrene at this point, then he either walked for 6 weeks or more, or he took a boat. But it still would have been an expensive trip no matter how he did it. We know that Simon did not volunteer to carry the cross, but was compelled to do so by the Roman officials. But what we can also see is that in spite of the fact that he did not choose to carry this cross, it had an impact on him. And Mark clues us into this likelihood in a few different ways. The first indication we have that Simon was changed and became a follower of Jesus is because, and important in the early church, is that he's identified as the father of Alexander and Rufus. And many of you have heard me say before that the primary purpose of the Bible is proclamation of God. It's not history. And the biblical writers weren't as concerned about having every historical fact just all nailed in and exactly right as people are, as historians are today. They didn't, and they were trying to make a larger point. And so they didn't always include every bit of information or all the detail about every encounter. They didn't, and so what they did include was important, and it bears recognizing and scrutinizing. Mark, as we said, is the earliest of the Gospels written, and he identifies Simon. And in part of the way as being from Cyrene, but he also identifies Simon by his sons, which means that those reading this Gospel of Mark would have been familiar with Alexander and Rufus. Alexander is not mentioned by name after this, but Rufus is. The consensus of people who study these things is that Simon, Rufus, and Alexander were leaders in the early church, known to the larger community of faith. And while it's not directly stated so, almost every Bible scholar believes that the Rufus mentioned by Mark here in his gospel is the same Rufus who's mentioned by the Apostle Paul in Romans 16:13, when he refers to Rufus as, quote, chosen in the Lord. In that, he also mentions Rufus's mother, and he calls her a mother to me also. So there's this close relationship between Rufus, at least, and the Apostle Paul. So we see that there is that from the earlier years of the church, that Rufus and Alexander and Simon would have been known to them. Another clue and another indication we have of who Simon is that Cyrene, which is in what is modern-day Libya, it was 900 miles by land from Jerusalem, but it was still an early center of the spread of the gospel back in that era. So there seems to be a connection between Simon and the development of Christianity pretty early on, even though it was so far away, and even though that there were other places kind of in between there where there had not yet been transmission of the gospel, that it got to Cyrene earlier, and the likelihood seems to be from Simon. We have to remember when reading Scripture that though the Gospels come first in order of how they're arranged in the Bible, chronologically speaking, in terms of authorship and dates of when the Gospels were actually written, they were written many years after the Apostle Paul wrote his letters. And the Apostle Paul is believed wrote his letters between around AD 48, 49 up into AD 64 or such. The earliest Gospel, Mark, the earliest date I've seen is maybe AD 65, but usually it's more around 70. So Paul would have written this letter to Rome many, many years before, and would have talked of Rufus many years before Mark actually writes down Rufus's name in this gospel account. So Rufus was somebody who was clearly known, and Paul again mentions him there in his letter. Yet another indication of the later importance of Simon of Cyrene is more subtle, but in its own way may be just as powerful and profound. Mark describes Simon of Cyrene as a passerby, and that word is significant because there's only two other times in the Gospel of Mark where that particular word derivation is used. One is when Jesus is passing along the Sea of Galilee and he calls Peter and Andrew. The other is when he's passing by Matthew the tax collector who's at his booth, and he calls Matthew to follow him. Though the specific phrase used is translated in English in different ways in those other times, the Greek phrasing in the Gospel of Mark is the same. Well, why might that be important? It's important because the other two times in which that phrase is specifically used, it is a prelude to a call by Jesus. It is a prelude to a transformed life. When Jesus called them, they responded, and their lives were changed forever. Well, it's clear that Jesus didn't directly call Simon of Cyrene as he did the others, but it also seems clear, at least to me, that Mark was letting us know that through him being compelled to carry the physical cross of Jesus, Simon was called by Jesus to follow him, and he spiritually followed him from this point on. Even if there wasn't a direct call, there was a life transformed. We get to the question about all this because I talk a lot about Simon, and because I just find it interesting. But we also have to look at the implications of why I would spend this time on Simon and saying, so what? So what that we know these things about Simon? So what that these things might have been the case? Why is it significant that Mark tells us the names of the sons, or he uses a particular word or phrase? Why did it matter then, and why does it matter now? And it's significant because, as best as we can tell, Simon was not a follower of Jesus before this encounter, but he was after this time. And this seemingly random encounter, when something happened to Simon that he had nothing to do with, and he's compelled to carry this cross, ends up changing and transforming his life, the life of his family, even the life of the community in Cyrene. He would have been in town for the Passover, but which means that he certainly did not come to see people crucified. He certainly did not come to see Jesus. He had no idea he'd be compelled to carry a cross, and he had no idea that his life was about to be irrevocably changed and go in a completely new direction. But as with that call of Peter and Andrew, who were just minding their business that day, and the call of Matthew, isn't that so often how it happens in our interactions with Jesus? When we're open to God's calling and the movement of God's Spirit, whether it's a life-changing event that calls us to give up our jobs or move somewhere, do something different, whether it leads us, whether the change is as noticeable on the outside as it is on the inside, as our perspective on the world and the perspective on others changes. It is true that you cannot have an encounter with Jesus and come away exactly the same. How many times have you had those moments during a day? They may have been huge things that happened. It may have been something simple, when all of a sudden you realized you had an insight, you had an encounter with somebody, and you realized at that point that something was different. You realized that you weren't going to be the same. You had an aha moment that changed your understanding and maybe even changed your life. That's what happens, you see, when we encounter the gospel of Christ. That we have that encounter, and so often it's even those times that we don't expect, that catch us off guard, that have the most profound impact. Through all of it, Jesus takes everything that is done to him. The arrest, the beating, the flogging, the ridicule, the taunts, maybe even things thrown at him by the crowd. I've watched a lot of different movies and TV shows and series over the year that have people walking to the gallows, or to do a penitent walk, a walk of shame. And though some of those things may be over dramatized, it's realistic to think that maybe those in that crowd, and we know that a crowd was there because Simon was in that crowd, that there are those in that crowd who all they know about Jesus, maybe some of those that did call for his crucifixion, and all they know about Jesus is that he's claiming to be a king, or that he's a blasphemer, all that's been told about him. And we can imagine, and I think it's very realistic to imagine people crowding the side of the road as Jesus is going there on that walk, jeering him, spitting upon him as well, throwing things at him. And that just not too many days from people lining the streets to lay their cloaks down and wave palm branches and say, "Hosanna to the Son of David," now they're jeering him, and they're spitting upon him, and they're throwing things at him. They're continuing the ridicule that the soldiers started. As Jesus goes there to the cross, to the place of a skull. There's one final little detail I want to look at, and that is wine mixed with myrrh is offered, but Jesus doesn't take it. The myrrh could mean one, or I think actually two things, and could mean both at the same time. Myrrh is associated with death and mourning. When the Magi bring the gifts of gold and frankincense, they also bring a gift of myrrh, and that's meant to be a foreshadowing of what will happen to Jesus. Here, at the end of his life, as at the beginning, he is offered wine mixed that has myrrh in it. And it's possible that one of the reasons that the myrrh is offered at this time is because myrrh was also an analgesic. It was a pain reliever. And it's possible that maybe somebody thought he might be a little thirsty. Maybe they're offering him a little bit of pain relief, however slight that pain relief might have been in relationship to the extreme suffering he'd already endured. So it's a symbol of death, and maybe it's a symbol, an indication that somebody was having a little bit of pity, but we don't really know. But Jesus doesn't take it. As we prepare to look at the actual crucifixion in the next lesson, I ask you to reflect on the following questions and thoughts. First, what does the reaction of the crowd tell us about ourselves as humans? What do you think of the idea that you, if you had been there, may have been complicit in and maybe even supportive of the kind of suffering Jesus endured? If you were there in that day and time, would you have been part of the crowd calling for the death of Jesus? Maybe you wouldn't have been part of the crowd calling for the death, but maybe you might have participated in the ridicule and mocking. Might you have been oblivious to the whole thing initially, a passerby who got caught up in the ordeal? All of these things that happened to Jesus seem so brutal and far-fetched to us in our own way, but we know that the same type of cruelty is around us. We know that the same type of cruelty happens in our own country today, happens in our own regions today. We like to think of ourselves as being above such coarseness, but it's pretty clear that we're not. When I think about this and I think about the reaction of people, and people, they are jeering him and taunting him, as we'll look at more next week in the next lesson when he's up there on the cross, and wondering about what would people do today, I can't help but think about times where there have been executions in our own country. And there are people out there outside the prison who are cheering and holding up signs and celebrating somebody's just. They clap and they cheer and they hug when somebody is killed. And regardless, this is not a time for a debate about the death penalty, but regardless about what you believe about the death penalty, it seems there's a line between believing that it might be necessary in certain circumstances and actually taking the time to travel to the place, or even where you are when you hear about it, actively congratulating and actively celebrating the death of another human being. Seeing somebody's life as so worthless as to celebrate death. Adam Hamilton, in his DVD portion of the study 24 Hours That Changed the World, recounts what we see, and he does it in his book too, what we see in the response of the people that goes all the way back to the start of when we start looking at what happened to Jesus there in the Garden of Gethsemane. He says we see the betrayal of Judas, the abandonment of the disciples, the denial of Peter, the jealousy of the Sanhedrin, the complicity and acquiescence of Pilate, the cruelty of the soldiers. We see the mocking and the ridicule. And he asked the question, I think it's an important question. He asked this question: what does that teach us about what we need saving from? Because we always have to remember that it wasn't just the sin of those people a long time ago. It was our sin that put Jesus on the cross. And anytime we think ourselves incapable of complicity, anytime we think ourselves incapable of a particular act or action, that is when we are most ripe for the fall. An awareness of our own sinfulness and the need of what we need to be saved from, the penalty and the depth of our own sin, reminds us that we as human beings are capable of far more good and evil than many times we think ourselves capable of. It's why we have to constantly be on guard and have our diligence about seeking to follow Christ and follow him fully, to live according to the principles and values of his kingdom, to live according to his commandments, and not the way that the world would look at things. As we move one step closer to the death of Christ, we see that Jesus, who the gospel writers go out of the way to remind us is innocent, totally innocent, that Jesus, this one who's innocent, came to save us who are guilty from our sins and from the sins of the whole world. He endured everything that was done to him. And in the next lesson, we will finish up and we will talk about that death and look more closely at that death of Jesus. And we will explore his response to all that's done to him as he faced now, and we are down now to the last hours of Jesus' life. Thank you for joining me during this time. I hope you heard something that was helpful to you, that maybe helps deepen your relationship, deepens your understanding and gratitude for all that God has done for you and all that Jesus endured for you. And I look forward to being with you in the next lesson. God bless you and have a great day.